Mr. Scary Studios.
A teenage girl was hiking through some woods up in southeast Canada one morning in 1951. She found a summer camp seeing a teenage boy painting a sign. "Hello, I am Debbie Sanders. I am the new camp counselor here." The girl introduced herself to him, explaining. The teenagers shook hands. "Hi, Debbie. I am Pete Newton, another camp counselor here. Welcome to Camp Maple." The teenage boy introduced himself and welcomed Debbie. Pete continued painting the sign blue that read, "Welcome to Camp Maple," in red letters. Debbie went into the cabin and put her bag on the bed, going into the kitchen. That evening, Pete Newton and Debbie Sanders sat around the campfire outside. There is a legend here about a woman who worked here when the camp opened in 1922. She was chopping weeds by one of the cabins and swatted some flies with her knife. She mistakenly hit her throat with it, falling down and decapitating herself, Pete told. Campers have seen her headless zombie wandering around the area each summer, he finished. "That is horrible, Pete," Debbie replied. "Just a story, Debbie," he answered, smoking a cigarette. "The kids have called this place Camp Headless for a few years," Pete said. Later on, as Debbie was cooking a pot of tomato soup on the stove, she heard a little knock on the cabin door. Debbie turned off the stove and looked out the cabin window. The door opened, and Debbie saw a headless zombie. It was dressed in a white dress, and its flesh was decaying and rotting. The decomposed neck oozed with a disgusting mix of slime, the colors of white and red. Debbie screamed in complete horror, opening the kitchen window and climbed out. Running, she ran through the darkness to another cabin. Debbie turned, watching the headless corpse approach her. A moldering head of brown and decaying flesh dangling in its rotting hand. The zombified head, with mold covered, long hair and black, hollow eye sockets, smiled, speaking to Debbie. "Good evening, young lady. Can I make you some tea?" Debbie felt the corpse's moldy hand of rot touch her hair, twisting and decomposed fingers on her scalp. "Pretty hair," the zombified head croaked in a dry voice. Debbie screamed and looked back, discovering the zombie was gone. The only sounds were the crickets. Carol heard it first and woke me up. She told me to listen. Then I heard it, bumping and scraping, shuffling and clattering. I turned on the light. The sound stopped. It was still our first month in the new house. By new, I mean new to us. It was quite old, over 100 years. Like any old house, it had its share of creaking and groaning, but we'd grown used to all that after the first couple of weeks. These sounds were new, unfamiliar, unsettling. We listened in silence for a few minutes. Nothing. Carol flipped on the TV, and we watched Chopped for a little while before getting tired enough to go back to sleep. And we did. The next morning, a Saturday, which was supposed to be a day for yard work, was spent sealing all of the visible cracks and holes around the baseboards and windows. Carol's concern, which I echoed, was a vermin infestation. Rats were a problem for some of the houses in the area. Our neighbor, a strange elderly fellow named Herman, had mentioned an opossum infestation in his barn in the 1990s. Just the cost of rural living, he proclaimed, before regaling to us with the details of how he dispatched them all in the course of an afternoon with a pitchfork. I made a trip to the hardware store and picked up a few rat traps. Nothing major, just enough to put in the basement and in a few other areas we thought they might traverse. Over the next week, when we heard those strange sounds again, we just assumed we were dealing with rats. We were a little grossed out, but the concern was mostly gone. Their days were numbered. It was only when the traps remained untouched that we started to feel a little uneasy. During a particularly bad, sleepless night when the bumping and shuffling sounds went on for hours, and I'd gotten out of bed and walked all around the house trying to find the source. I was frustrated and exhausted. I traced the loudest of noises to a closet in the hallway, hoping to scare the rats into shutting up. I pounded on the closet's interior wall when my fist struck the old board. The board next to it fell out. Scared the hell out of me. Expecting rats to start scurrying towards me, I grabbed the board and got ready to beat as many to death as I could. No rats came, but the sounds had stopped. There was only the soft din of whatever TV show Carol was watching in the bedroom. I was getting ready to replace the board when I saw something on the ground behind where the piece had fallen out. I picked it up, a scrap of newspaper with the headline, "Another Infant Missing, 17th in 10 months." It was dated March 3rd, 1933. I shuddered and shoved the scrap in my pajama pocket. Of all things the rat could use to make their nests, it had been to be something so morbid. As I started to replace the board, the sound resumed. This time, it was far louder than ever. The bump shook the house, and a clattering like 1,000 rattlesnakes filled the air. The power cut out upstairs. Carol hollered. I ignored her. Something else had grabbed my attention. After the first violent bump before the lights went out, I saw 2 adjacent boards in the closet had fallen away. They revealed a much larger space behind the closet than I'd thought. I felt my way to the kitchen and grabbed a flashlight out of the drawer. I flipped it on and jumped a mile. When I saw Carol standing across the room, she looked frightened and annoyed. I grabbed her hand and we marched to the hall closet. The rattling persisted. We peered into the kitchen compartment and followed the beam of the flashlight. Something on the floor glinted back. I started to squeeze between the boards to get closer. Carol grabbed my arm and told me not to go in. I shook her off. I made my way inside and saw something bizarre. A metallic, glittery wand and a very large tiara. Way too big for a child. A piece of cloth was underneath. I picked it up and shook away the dust. The letters TF were emblazoned across it in garish, cartoonish cursive. The rattling grew deafening. I turned around and saw Carol holding her ears and crying. I aimed the flashlight around the rest of the space. A large bucket sat in the corner. The 2 steps it took to reach it only served to increase the amplitude of the noise. As soon as I pointed the flashlight beam inside, the sound stopped. The bucket trembled in the yellowish light. Inside were more newspaper clippings with equally disturbing headlines. More missing infants. The more I pulled out and read, the numbers kept rising. The last one said 88, December 12th, 1941. There was a thick piece of cardstock under them. I lifted it and uncovered more pieces of paper. They were different, handwritten, just numbers and dates, and what looked like prices. April 4th, 1939-3, $30. June 23rd, 1945-10, $95. October 1st, 1946-2, $25. And so on. There were lots of these receipts. I assumed Carol had entered the room and stood next to me, clutching my arm. Under the receipts was another piece of cardstock. I lifted it away and uncovered a few handfuls of little pebbles or seashells. Sticking out of them was a small, colorful play card with the same cursive as the cloth. We read it together. Carol screamed and I felt faint. Right then, I knew what the TF meant on the cloth. Cloth that had been, I realized, a cape. I dropped the play card back in the bucket. The contents rattled in bright pink hand-painted letters. The words stared back up at us. For sale, baby teeth, never used. The man led the little girl into a large dark room, and she saw in the middle another man, worn and dressed in tattered clothing, sitting on a park bench. Next to him was a large grandfather clock and a lamp post illuminating the immediate area. The rest of the room was black. She saw that the fence on the clock was approaching 8. The face on the clock was approaching 8. Watch closely, little one. Watch closely, the man said to her. The big hand struck the hour, and the worn man stood up, pulled out a knife, and slit his throat. He fell to the ground under a fountain of crimson. The girl turned her head aside, but the man put his hand on top of her head, turning it and forcing her to watch. It will be all right, see? She gasped, but kept her composure. The worn man laid in the pool of his own blood in front of the clock and the bench. Then she looked up at the man, and he nodded. We will wait until the closing of this new hour, and you will see what happens next, little one. They stood as the worn man's body became an island in a sea of blood. Under white light in a center of darkness, the grandfather clock towered over the corpse, the bench empty. Here, go and sit down, little one, he said to her. She looked up at him, faltering, and he stared down at her. He was silent, but his eyes conversed with her. Go and sit now, girl. She slowly walked and stepped into the light, staring down at the corpse. The dead man was without life. The knife was drenched in dark red, reflecting the lamp's light. The girl sat down uneasy and looked back at the man in the distance. He stared at her with no emotion in his face, slowly stepping backwards into the darkness. She looked up at the clock, and it was only 8:06. She looked down at the body, then sat up on the bench and put her arms around her knees. She looked up at the black, waiting for the man to reappear, but she was left alone. Time dragged on forever, and she sat as she was told. She stared out into the darkness, zoning out under the bright light. Then she heard footsteps and snapped out of her daze. She looked up at the clock, and it displayed 8:58. She sat up, alert. Watching closely, my friend. Watch closely. The man's voice said to an older woman as they stepped out of the darkness. The girl saw them, and then saw the clock was closing in on the hour. She quickly stood up and started to run away, but there was a loud bang, then silence. He walked over to her body, still and void of life, then looked at the older woman. Here, go and sit down, ma'am. The woman sat on the bench. The grandfather clock read 9:04. Creeping, scratching, moving around in the walls. Knocking can be heard all over the house. There's something in the walls, something that watches. It is dark, and as the night cold as a winter breeze. Emotionless, it moves. Soundless, it moves. Since I was a young boy, this thing had lived in the house. Watching, waiting for the right moment. I've known it's been there. I saw it. Its presence I have felt. When I've been alone, it was always there right beside me. No one could see it but me. People would be scared if they could see him. He is dark like the shadows in old houses. Sometimes he gets mad, but I think it's because he is lonely. He has no friends like me. He whispers to me sometimes. Sometimes I get scared, but he tells me I'm okay. He tells me he'll protect me. I haven't told Mom about him because she would get scared. What she doesn't know is he's my father. He died March 7, 2010. forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.